It was just a coin, a silver tetradrachm having passed through thousands of hanes from the shores of Greece to the plains of India. The profile of a young conqueror, struck with an almost defiant confidence. Just another symbol of power, unless you looked closely at what was sprouting from beneath his hair. Two tight, curving horns, a ram's horns. This was no mere ornament. This was indeed one of the most audacious and dangerous political gambits in history, the story of how a man decided that being a king wasn't enough, and made the entire world believe he was a god. History, like a mighty river, sometimes forges strange and unbelievable chimeras in its twisting currents. It mixes peoples, cultures, and beliefs, fusing them in the crucible of time into something entirely new. And one of the most astonishing chimeras born in the fires of the ancient world bore a double name. How was this possible? How could two supreme deities, two pillars of entirely different worlds, the Greek thunderer and the Egyptian creator, God, merge into a single being? And why did the greatest conqueror in history, Alexander the Great, cross a merciless desert just so the priests of a remote oasis would proclaim him the son of this bizarre, hybrid deity? The answer to this riddle isn't just a story about religion. It's a story about power, ambition, and how one brilliant idea can change the world. To understand this fusion, you have to travel back more than 3,000 years, into the churning cauldron of the ancient Mediterranean. This wasn't the world of clean lines we see on maps. This was a sea where the ships of Phoenicians, Greeks, and Egyptians plied the waters like shuttles on a loom. They carried more than just amphorae of wine and olive oil, more than cedar wood and copper. On their sails, they carried ideas, and in the depths of their holds, alongside the cargo, lay the most precious freight of all: gods, myths, and rituals. The world was shot through with the divine. Every storm was the wrath of Poseidon, every harvest the grace of Demeter, and the flooding of the Nile the will of Hopi. When a Greek merchant or mercenary stepped ashore in the Nile Delta, he entered a world where the temple walls were carved with men who had the heads of falcons, jackals, and crocodiles, where the supreme god was depicted sometimes as a man with a crown of two tall feathers, and other times as a ram with mighty curling horns. How to make sense of this alien, bizarre pantheon? Dismiss it as barbarian superstition. The Greeks were far too curious and pragmatic for that. They did something else. They engaged a unique cultural mechanism, one that scholars would later call interpretatio, or called a Greek interpretation. To put it simply, they looked at a foreign god and tried to find familiar features. They were, in essence, asking themselves, who among our gods does he most resemble? It was their way of bringing order to the chaos of a foreign faith, of translating it into a language they could understand. They saw the Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth, depicted as an ibis, and said, oh, so that's their version of Hermes, our messenger of the gods and patron of knowledge. They met the warrior goddess Neith with her bow and arrows and recognized their own Artemis. This wasn't an attempt to erase another culture. On the contrary, it was an act of profound recognition, a search for a universal divine principle that, they believed, simply wore different names in different lands. And then they encountered Ammon, Ammon of Thebes. His name meant the Hidden One. He wasn't just a god. He was the air, the breath of life, the invisible force that fills all of existence. Later, after merging with the sun god Ra, he became Amun-Ra, king of the gods, creator of the universe, father of the pharaohs. His main temple at Karnak was not just a building, it was a stone forest of gigantic columns, a city of the gods on earth, a place of such power and antiquity that it inspired awe in even the most hardened skeptics. The Greeks who witnessed the majesty of the Karnak temple understood whoever was worshipped here was the number one figure, the head honcho, the big boss. Just as back home, on the snowy peak of Olympus, their own big boss ruled Zeus. The resemblance was obvious. Both were kings of the gods. Both were givers of life and supreme judges. Both were associated with the sky and ultimate authority. But the deciding detail, the final piece that completed the puzzle, was one of Ammon's sacred symbols, the ram. Not just any ram, but a specific breed with powerful, elegantly curved horns. In some Greek cults, especially archaic ones, Zeus was also sometimes associated with the ram as a symbol of fertility and power. And so, when the Greeks saw the statues and reliefs of Ammon, a majestic god, sometimes depicted with the head of a ram or as a man with ram's horns, a switch flipped in their minds. The horns was it. This was Zeus, but in his Egyptian guise. And so Zeus-Ammon was born a deity with the face and character of a Greek, but crowned with the sacred horns of an Egyptian king of the gods. His image became the symbol of the fusion of two of the world's greatest civilizations. And it was for this symbol, for the stamp of divine approval from this incredible chimera, that Alexander would embark on his riskiest campaign, not for gold or for new lands, but for the right to call himself the son of the god who united East and West. This is the incredible story of Alexander the Great, Part 11, The Pharaoh. You can find Part 10 in the description below. Alexander's armies had just crossed the Persians at the Granicus River in Issus, But the jewel of the East, the great kingdom of Persia, was still in the hands of the old king had fled northwards, licking his wounds and raising new armies. And soon he would face Alexander again, this time on the plains of But that battle, too, was still far in the future. And for now, Alexander had other plans. As the armies rested, recuperated, and resupplied, he set his sights on the fat, undefended prize of Egypt. And so, in 332 BC, that campaign began. The wheels of history groaned and turned, and Alexander himself stepped onto the stage. His army, hardened in the battles of the Granicas and Issus, crashed upon the shores of Egypt like a steel tide. But instead of meeting resistance, the Macedonians saw something astonishing. The Persian satrap ruling the country surrendered it without a fight, knowing resistance was futile. And the Egyptian people themselves, they poured into the streets not with stones and curses, but with palm fronds and flowers. To them, Alexander wasn't just another foreign tyrant. He was a deliverance. The Persians had bled Egypt dry for decades, like a wicked, greedy guardian. They had plundered the treasury, scorned the local gods, and violated ancient traditions. They were outsiders, and they were hated. And the young Macedonian king, who had crushed their common enemy, looked in the eyes of the Egyptians like an avenger sent by the gods themselves. He was a liberator, and most importantly, the throne of the pharaohs was vacant. Alexander, a genius not only in war but in politics, instantly caught this wind of change. He didn't act like a conqueror. He entered the ancient capital of Memphis and went not to the palace, but straight to the temple. He made lavish sacrifices to the Apis Spool, the living embodiment of the god Ptah, whom the Persians had once insulted. The gesture was louder than any proclamation. It said, "I respect your faith, I respect your land, I am one of you." And the priests, the guardians of millennia of wisdom, answered him. They performed the ancient coronation ritual, placing upon his head the Pashanta double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. In that moment, the 24-year-old Macedonian ceased to be merely a king. He became a living god, Horus in the flesh, lord of the two lands, the pharaoh. But for Alexander, that wasn't enough. The title of pharaoh made him legitimate in the eyes of Egyptians, but to his Greek soldiers in the entire Hellenic world, it was just an exotic ceremony. He needed something more, something universal. He needed a sign that would be understood in Thebes and in Athens. He needed Zeus. And so he embarked on the most insane and most important journey of his life. Not against an enemy army, but against nature itself. He announced he was marching to the Siwa oases. His generals were horrified. Siwa was a tiny speck of green lost in the boundless ocean of the Libyan desert. Hundreds of miles of scorched, waterless earth where caravans vanished without a trace, where sandstorms could bury an entire army alive. Why? Why risk everything his life, his men, the future of the entire campaign for a visit to some oracle in a god-forsaken place? But Alexander was adamant. He understood what they did not. Siwa was home to the most revered oracle of Ammon outside of Egypt proper, the very oracle the Greeks had long identified with Zeus. To receive its blessing was to receive the highest possible seal of divine legitimacy. The journey was a living hell. The desert, like a white-hot skillet, tested their endurance. The sun burned their eyes. The searing sand scorched their feet through their sandals. Soon, their water ran out. The guides lost their way. Death was breathing down the necks of the exhausted soldiers. And then, as the legends tell it, a miracle occurred. First, the heavens split open and unleashed a life-saving downpour. Then, as the storm subsided, two birds, or as some claimed, two talking crows appeared and showed the army the true path. After 8 days of torment, a saving sliver of green appeared on the horizon, the oasis. You might think that Alexander the Great is a figure of legend, but it's easy to forget that he was once a little kid. He grew up in the royal court of Pella, playing among the marble columns and fountains of the palace, while his father, King Philip II of Macedon, was busy conquering the rest of Greece. When Alexander was 13 years old, his father was assassinated, and the teenage Alexander took the throne. Soon enough, he too started dreaming of conquest, inspired by stories of the legendary heroes of Homer's Iliad. When he was just 20 years old, he assembled an elite military force of 7,000 Macedonian infantry and 2,000 cavalry. Then he set out to conquer the Persian Empire, an immense and wealthy realm that stretched from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. For 7 years, Alexander's armies clashed with the Persians, fighting across the deserts of the Middle East and the battlefields of the Levant. At the city of Granicus, he defeated the Persians decisively, pushing his army deeper and deeper into enemy territory. Finally, after a grueling siege, he captured the great city of Tyre. The inhabitants surrendered only on the promise that their lives would be spared. But as Alexander rode through the streets of the jubilant city, he noticed the people hiding in doorways, cowering behind shields. What do they fear? He asked his advisors. They are afraid that we will break our word and kill them despite our promise, came the reply. Alexander paused, then said, "If I keep my word with this small folk, how can I possibly harm the vast Persian Empire?" Why should they trust me? That's when Alexander realized that his empire would need a unifying symbol, a chimera that would bind two utterly alien cultures together. That's when he decided to visit the Oracle of Ammon in the Egyptian city of Siwa, disguised as a common soldier, because no king had ever visited the oracle without bringing a massive retinue. When he arrived, he was greeted like a god descended from the heavens. The priests of the temple of Ammon led him into the Holy of Holies, a dark, sacred inner sanctum where no mortal, save for themselves, was ever allowed. What exactly happened in there, shrouded in the smoke of incense, we will never know. Alexander never shared the details, but when he emerged, his face was radiant. Later, rumors reached the world. Based on the accounts of his inner circle, the high priest, greeting the king, had addressed him as O Paidios, which in Greek means O, Son of God descended. It may have been a simple slip of the tongue. The old priest struggled with Greek and perhaps meant to say O Padion, which means O, my son. But to Alexander and his men, the words rang out like prophecy. The oracle had confirmed it. Alexander was not just a pharaoh. He was the son of Ammon himself. It was here, at the edge of the known world, that Alexander the Macedonian, who cut his teeth conquering Greece, met Alexander the Great, the man destined to rule half the earth. This moment of revelation was the hinge of world history, because from this point forward, Alexander's genius shone in all its glory. He didn't reject his Greek heritage. He didn't become a purely Egyptian deity. He fused two worlds within his own person. For the Egyptians, he was the son of Ammon. For the Greeks, he was the son of Zeus. And for everyone else, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Indians, for all the peoples of his future, vast empire, he became the son of Zeus-Ammon. It was the perfect propaganda tool. It unified. It didn't divide. It inspired religious awe. It explained his unbelievable victories not merely as talent, but as divine destiny. To make this new status something you could see and touch, Alexander did something unheard of. He ordered the minting of new coins, silver tetradrachms that would soon find their way into every corner of the known world, and on them was his profile. But this wasn't just the profile of a mortal king. On these coins, bursting from beneath, the young conqueror's thick hair, were two mighty, curved ram's horns, the horns of Ammon. Every merchant in Athens, every soldier in Babylon, every official in Egypt who took one of these coins into his hand, held in his palm the undeniable truth: their master was no mere man. He was a god. The Chimera, born at the crossroads of two worlds, had been made flesh. But even gods made flesh are mortal. The great Chimera, a fusion of king and deity, was forged from genius, ambition, and flesh. And the flesh proved to be the most brittle part of this alchemy. In 323 BC, at the very peak of his power, in a lavish Babylonian palace, Alexander the Great, son of Zeus-Ammon, conqueror of the world, was brought low by a fever. The god who could not be stopped by Persian armies, Indian elephants, or merciless deserts was felled by an unseen enemy that had taken root in his blood. His empire, stitched together with the iron thread of his will and held fast by the divine status of his person, was a colossus built upon a single pillar, and when that pillar collapsed, the whole grand edifice shattered into pieces. His generals, his companions, who just yesterday had sworn fear, turned into a pack of wolves descending on the carcass of their fallen leader. They tore his legacy to shreds, carving out kingdoms for themselves from the scraps of his conquests. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Asia Minor, all of it, plunged into the chaos of a fratricidal bloodbath known as the Wars of the Diet. The dream of a unified Hellenistic empire, where Greek, Persian, and Egyptian were equal subjects under one god-king, died with him. It seemed that the Chimera of Zeus-Ammon, that delicate cultural bridge, would be torn down with everything else. But one wolf proved shrewder and more far-sighted than the pack. His name was Ptolemy, a childhood friend of Alexander and one of his most trusted commanders. While the others were squabbling over armies and Ptolemy understood that true power lay not just in spears and gold, but in symbols. He pulled off the most audacious heist of the age. He stole Alexander's body. The funeral procession, wending its way slowly from Babylon to Macedonia, and the mummified remains of the god king were spirited away to Egypt. It was a masterstroke. Ptolemy hadn't just stolen a corpse. He had seized a holy relic, the very font of legitimacy. He became the keeper of the sacred body, and thus its spiritual heir. Having established himself in Egypt, he didn't stamp out Egyptian culture, he took it over. He had himself crowned as pharaoh, made sacrifices to the ancient gods, and continued the project of cultural fusion on a scale previously unimagined. I'm the host. See you next time. Once upon a time, there was a man who woke up in the middle of the night, looked around in confusion, and asked himself, "Who am I?" His name was Ptolemy, and he was the new pharaoh of Egypt. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted more. He wanted to be the son of Zeus. It's a good thing he asked that question. Otherwise, how would he have explained all those stunningly handsome men in mirrors? How would he have explained those magnificent armies that followed him into battle? How would he have explained those thrilling victories that put him on the throne of the greatest kingdom on earth? No, These things were explained by his divine parentage, his bloodline leading directly to Zeus. Only one problem though. There was no oracle of Siv, at least not one that anyone could find anymore. And there was no way to prove his divine lineage. Ptolemy had a problem. Alexander was a warlord. His divine status was a one-man show. Ptolemy couldn't just declare himself the new son of Zeus. He agreed Conqueror needed a god that both his Macedonian soldiers and the local priests from Memphis could worship. A god who made sense to both the Greek and the Egyptian. And if that god didn't exist, then he would have to be invented, in what can only be described as a theological laboratory. Gathering priests and philosophers, the Ptolemies engineered a new deity, the ultimate divine hybrid. Look at his statue. He has the appearance of a Greek god. He has the thick beard and wavy hair of Zeus or Hades. He sits enthroned, a lord of all. But look closer at the details. On his head is not a crown, but a calathos or modius, a special basket used for measuring grain. This was a direct nod to the Egyptian god Osiris, lord of the underworld and a symbol of rebirth and fertility. His very name was a mashup of Osiris Apis, the name given to the soul of the sacred Apis pool after its death, when it merged with Osiris. So, to a Greek, Serapis was a recognizable supreme deity, a familiar face. But to an Egyptian, he was a new form of their ancient god, tied to the cycle of life, death, and resurrection. This was a goddess diplomatic, custom-built to secure the power of a Greek dynasty on the ancient land of the pharaohs. The Chimera of Zeus-Ammon had given birth to a new, even more complex and successful offspring. And this process, set in motion by the curiosity of Greek merchants and the genius of Alexander, could no longer be stopped. Cultural exchange became a two-way street. If before the Greeks had interpreted Egyptian gods through their own lens, now Egyptian beliefs themselves flooded out of the Nile Valley, conquering the hearts and minds of the entire Mediterranean. And the most successful conqueror of all was the goddess Isis, wife of Osiris. Unlike the Olympian gods of and capricious, aloof and absorbed in their own petty squabbles, Isis offered something different. She was the divine mother, a symbol of devotion, suffering, and all-conquering love. Her myth is story of her scouring the earth to gather the dismembered body of her murdered husband and bring him back to life with a chord in every soul. She wasn't just a goddess, she was a savior figure. Her cult promised not only protection in this life, but the hope of a blessed immortality in the next. Soon, all across the Roman Empire, from Britain to Syria, her tepos their Isian, Roman legionaries, merchants, and aristocrats knelt before the statues of the Egyptian goddess, took part in her mystery rites, and sought comfort in her embrace. The secret born in the sands of the Siwa oasis had snowballed into a global cultural phenomenon. Now, obviously this isn't the last word on the subject. As we know, Isis and Serapis were popular in the Greco-Roman world, but how much influence they actually had over the later development of Christianity is debatable. For a look at the other side of the argument, check out the series link below.